Artist and studio processes take one art. Photography as an art form has been a medium which has captivated audiences around the world for centuries. Two examples of very influential photographers are Vivian Maier and Henri Cartier-Bresson. Vivian Dorothy Maier, originally born on the 1st of February 1926, grew up in New York in the United States. She mainly focused on black and white analog photography. Her photos were only discovered after she died. She worked as a nanny in Chicago for about 40 years before then transitioning to other parts of America in her later life. She pursued photography in the background throughout her entire career. Her work had a sense of urban poetry, tenderness, and kindness, which mesmerized audiences and artistic institutions around the world. She also delves into the realm of self-portraiture, using mirrors as a means to demonstrate a rejection of gendered expectations, shedding light on the invisibility of an unmarried, childless woman and childcare worker. She began to capture the spontaneity of street life, precision reminiscent of Henri Cartier-Bresson, street portraits evocative of Lisette Mondel, and fantastical compositions similar to Andre Courbet's. For some historical context surrounding Vivian Maier, we can look at the moods, attitudes, and conditions which existed during the time which she was alive, and how this might have influenced her choices when she was taking photos. In 2007, a massive body of photographs would come to light as her work was discovered at a local thrift auction in Chicago's northwest side. John Maloof, the person who found the photographs, was then tasked with going through all the negatives, over 100,000, and piecing them together throughout Vivian's timeline. This then resulted in the documentary Finding Vivian Maier being made, and was available to the world. We can now look at the cultural context surrounding Vivian Maier's work. Cultural context can be defined as the upbringing and cultural background of the artist, and how this influenced and changed their view and perception on the world. In photography, this is a huge factor, as the artist will only take photographs of things that they see as important, or things they would like to share with a wider audience. The cultural context of the time. In 1935, Roy Stryker initiates a monumental photography project to document the Depression through the Resettlement Administration, which later became the Farm Security Administration. Dorothy Lange and Walker Evans were among those who photographed the project, and these heavily influenced Vivian Maier's perception of the outside world. In 1935, Eastman Kodak introduces the Kodachrome color transparency film in modern color spectrum. Maier temporarily explored in the color space and used her works to explore a new element of photography. We now turn to look at some examples of Maier's work through the years. This one photo from 1954 is untitled, but comes from a street collection Maier took throughout the years. It depicts a group of figures standing defiantly in the immediate foreground of the sidewalk of an inner city street. Two being adult women, the other two assumedly being the children. Behind them, a tall, towering city blocks rise up, and the pavement is dirty at their feet. They all wear summer-like clothing, with one of the children wearing overalls and a short-sleeved shirt underneath. They have apprehensive facial expressions about all four of them, and each of them is mimicking each other's body language. This photo was shot in analog film photography using Maier's Rolleiflex 3.5T. Through Maier's capture, we can see a strong thematic concerns emerge, most predominantly being the idea of motherhood and family identity. We as the viewer do not have any information as to whether this was posed or candid shot, but we can deduct from the manner of the postures the idea of mimicking that the figurative tool for conveying their childlike perspective is used. The dress and cleanliness of the figures might also indicate some more about their own identity, such as their class, appearing to be middle working, and their financial situation. Maier employs a wide range of the art elements and principles into her work, using them to evoke and formulate an emotive response in the viewer. Tone is strongly used throughout her work, especially in Street 5 collection, as all her photos on the grayscale. Having meaningful and deep tone is crucial for creating the art principles of contrast and focal point. There is also this feeling of scale introduced, closely linked to that of proportion, demonstrated through the difference in height and appearance the figures have. That then compared to the surrounding mise-en-scene. The buildings appear almost warped, fading endlessly away into the background. This idea also links to the previous mentioned inner suburbia, which these children are brought up in. A sense of ugliness has been achieved by Maier intuitively working with the elements and principles of art. For some context surrounding the time that this photo was taken, through the 1940s to the late 1950s, the United Nations headquarters was being constructed. The UNHQ was an popular place for photographers such as Maier to explore and be a part of, as there was a certain demographic shift which occurred post-World War II, giving the New York City a new face. In 1953 to 1957, large amounts of what used to be independent housing were demolished to make way for new large-scale public housing commission blocks. This is what can be seen in the background of Maier's photo. In 1955, the Village Voice newspaper and the American News was introduced. This was the country's first alternative news weekly paper and began production quickly, becoming a platform for the creative community in New York City. My interpretation of this artwork is complex and multifaceted, as we as children are always mimicking and copying the actions and expressions of those around us, especially those of the immediate family, in particular our mothers. This idea that children are seeing the world through their lens and then taught how to act and behave in accordance with their same views is something which Maier is able to carry through her photographs. Maier's second artwork, which we will focus on, is also from her Street 5 collection, but the date is unknown. This photo depicts a man standing at a jarring angle in the immediate foreground of the image, as he has a balancing motion about him and is leaning off to one side with a cane. Surrounded by a bustling street filled with passerbys, the man stands out as a peculiarity amongst what would have been quite a mundane and disinteresting picture. His presence in the frame, highlighted by its centrality and vertical nature, allows the viewer's eyes to be drawn to his odd manner. This was shot on Vivian's same Rolleiflex 3.5T camera on analog black and white film. The man depicted can be assumed to have some kind of walking impairment, which gives him this limp-like action. This is further solidified by the need for a cane to be supporting him. Maier is capturing the moment where, in the time of creation during the 1950s, having an impairment or difference in the ability was seen as freakish or abnormal. For this, a large amount of ableism and social prejudice was placed against people with disabilities. Maier, I believe, was aware of this commonly held mentality, and so sought to depict instances like this which in a way to normalize the appearance of those who are seen as different to the wider public eye. This particular photograph employs two main elements and principles of art, the first being that of implied movement and balance. The man, who is seen directly in front of the camera, has the sort of lean surrounding his posture and carries with him the peculiarity which translates through Maier's lens to the rigid and robotic-like motion. Shape also plays a key role in the composition of the photo, allowing to contrast between what is seen in the man's shadow and helps distinguish between that of what is bright on the pavement and the crisp outline of the figure. In addition, shadow also links to the previously mentioned element of shape, as it gives the viewer an entirely new morphed appearance of the man, a three-dimensional being, onto the pavement, a two-dimensional space. This blended perspective gives the subject an almost pseudo-personality, another being which acts on its own accord, a projection of the main figure's physical shape on the ground beside him. For some context surrounding the time in which the photograph was taken, in 1950, Richard Averton starts collating a series of portraits, shooting and trademarking them with all stark wide backgrounds. He contributed to the life, looks and photograph work. It was known for allowing all his models to show more than emotion, which was the norm back then. Maier employs a similar type of intimate connection with the subject, going close enough to gain an understanding, but further away enough to see it from an outsider's point of view. The immediate intrigue of this photograph to me, and what grabbed me about it so much, is its highly unique and strange composition reminiscent of the time in which it depicts. An element which stood out for me the most, however, was not the central figure at all, but more the faces of the people looking surrounding him. Looking down the right of the frame, in the distance appears a small group of individuals, one of whom is turned to face the oncoming central subject. This distant figure's expression links back to that apprehension and distaste which was thrown at people who did have a difference in their ability, shunning them and casting dirty looks such as the one seen here. Maier was simply capturing the moment as it unfolded, so we can take this as a fairly raw and untainted window into the period of the 1950s. Our second artist to look at today is that of Henri Cartier-Bresson. Henri Cartier-Bresson, born on the 22nd of August 1908, was a French humorist photographer, considered a master of candid photography and an early user of 35mm film. He pioneered in the genre of street photography and viewed photography as capturing the decisive moment. Cartier-Bresson was one of the founding members of Magnum Photos in 1947, which was an organization aimed to help bring photographers from all walks of life and around the world together on a global scale. Through his work, Bresson was able to establish photojournalism as an actual art form, the humanness and spontaneity allowing his photos to flourish in the public eye. Historical context is key in describing Bresson's upbringing, as he was in a world which was in such political turmoil and war, which influenced his photography in later years. In 1937, captured in Germany, 3 attempts and 3 years later, he escaped. This experience colored a new perception of life and a new appreciation of people. In 1947, Bresson became influenced by Robert Capa, changing his overall vision and approach to photojournalism from the more surrealist work he had been previously doing. We now turn to look at some of Bresson's works. Here, in 1948, in an image titled Gold Rush in Shanghai, depicted here in one of Bresson's images from the series China, is the scene playing out in front of a bank in inner city Shanghai during the gold rush period. This shot was taken close to the end of the day, as hasty scrambles to buy gold come to fruition. A crowd of civilians all piling on top of one another to get a share of the wealth which China had to offer at the time. Most of the crowd is wearing long coats, and the clothing is plain and beige from what can be depicted through the grayscale photograph. Like Maier, Bresson also uses analog black and white film photography, but this time on a Leica rangefinder, a more expensive camera from earlier on in the era. Through his travels to China, Bresson gained a highly unique and soulistic understanding of the world around him, and it was a polar opposite from where he had come from, being in New York City. He drew contrast between the lives that people lived, comparing the slums of Manhattan to the desolate wastelands of suburban Shanghai. He was able to see how in Shanghai, freedom and liberty was something which came just as precious as the gold that they were mining and was worth twice as much. Bresson uses a combination of multiple elements and principles to affect the overall message he's trying to convey through the madness of this photograph. The scene playing out before the viewer can only be described as chaotic and messy, with a large proportion and implied movement, as well as the variety amongst the people within the frame. The shakiness of the camera and the slightly blurry outline of the figures allows the audience to envision how the scene would have actually played out in real life. Historical context here is key to understand how Japan and China's political interplay affected the rest of the world, and how this leaked into Bresson's own photography. In 1934 to 1935, Mao Zedong emerges as the communist leader during the party's long march to its new base in the Shaanxi province. In 1949, the proclamation of the People's Republic of China commences, and under new laws there are several bans or regulations. One of these is photography. For some cultural context surrounding the social norms of the time in China, in 1937 through 1945, the War of Resistance broke out, highlighting another major fissure in the Chinese society, and redrew a cultural map of the country. In 1948, Henri Cartier-Bresson was commissioned by the Life magazine to shoot a short story of the last days in Beijing for the arrival of the Maoist troops. Having planned for going for 2 weeks, he would actually stay for 10 months, mainly in the Shanghai area, witnessing the fall of the city of Nanjing, held by the Kuomintang. My initial response to the image shown here was quite confronted, as it depicts such a desperate and trying time for both the Chinese and world history. The amount of people who went through this amount of trauma and near-death experiences is unimaginable, so to see a scene like this play out in front of me was quite an eye-raising encounter. My thoughts mainly surrounding that of the emotive power behind the photo such as this, where so much is happening all at one time, you become so transfixed in the one moment, you forget it is merely a snapshot in one time. Looking now to the second artwork by Henri Cartier-Bresson, again from the China series, is 1958's construction of the Beijing University swimming pool by students. Again, this photograph is even more disturbing, taken 10 years after the previous one, and shows the communist overthrow in mainland China. Bresson has been able to freely capture the brutal work conditions of young students who were set to work by construction on the Beijing University swimming pool. Here depicted in the immediate foreground is a young girl, heaving behind a wheelbarrow of mud and dirt from the excavation site. Behind, we see the muddy pool of water which has begun to form at the bottom of the pit. A boy is also present in the frame, helping the girl push the barrow up a slippery incline. Both children look malnourished and severely thin. At the time, China was responsible for a wave of starvation and famine, with a large amount of trade controlled by now communist forces. This photograph is also on black and white analog film, and also taken on Bresson's Leica rangefinder. He shows here an ironic scenario, where school children are being forced into manual labor for construction of a new university which they are most likely to never get a chance to attend. There is this sense of loss and desperation in their movement, as if they are giving their all to their work, but in return are receiving very little. Through his use of two major art elements and principles, Bresson is able to convey the audience a feeling of his work through the aesthetic qualities behind it. His careful craft of form as an element helps to show how the figure is in the immediate foreground is hunched over, back broken due to the strenuous and intensive work which is thrust upon them. The implied momentum of the figure is also felt through the motions of their arms and hair, with the tension of the rope that they pull also being representing of that paranoia and trauma that possesses their mind. Overall, Vivian Maier and Henri Cartier-Bresson share a likeness in their photography, but each can be seen with their own individualist stylistic choices. Vivian Maier, for instance, has taken a lot of inspiration from Henri Cartier-Bresson, but he was the pioneer in photography initially. Through his works around the world, especially those in China and Paris, we can see how his style has developed through a range of eras and political tensions. Maier, on the other hand, has stayed more solely in the United States, capturing the life which is very localized to her own community and her own locale.